and I lead the rural team's broadband and digital equity portfolio. We're so privileged to have grown a program over the last 3 years that has engaged longtime rural LISC partners, as well as helped us develop new partner relationships in rural communities all over the country. You all have helped bring new broadband networks to communities. You've distributed many hundreds of computers to rural households, and you've enabled thousands of residents all over the nation to use technology to improve quality of life for themselves and their families. So those are some of the themes we want to talk about today. And thank you to our current partners in this work for being in the virtual room and the physical room today. Thanks for joining us also if this is a new area of work for your community and you're here to learn. Today, we're going to talk about designing scalable co-funding solutions for broadband and digital equity, where I'm honored to welcome a few of rural LISC's closest friends and collaborators in this space, Brian Rathbone, Benya, Jerry, and we hope Zaki will join us from the Aspen Institute virtually. They are among some of the most innovative and engaged leaders in the broadband space. And with their help, we're going to cover a lot of ground today. So I'd like to ask our panel, and Zaki's here, welcome. I'd like to ask each of you to take us through about 10 minutes of your perspective on how you came into your digital equity work. I think that'll get us really grounded in a lot of the diverse topics in this space. We'll talk about, as a panel, some of the bigger themes that emerge, and then we'd really like to hear from the audience and make this kind of a working session where you can lift up how your community is tackling broadband availability, broadband affordability, digital adoption, skilling, computer access. We really want to understand what kind of the major issues that are in play for local communities across our networks so that we could then start to position one another for resources and maximize investment. So $42 billion is coming online starting in 2024 to bring high-speed broadband to places that have for far too long sat on the other side of the digital divide. Together with a number of other federal and state funding programs, we're just months into seeing communities realize what is recognized by many as once-in-a-generation investment in the essential infrastructure that really is going to move local economies forward. Broadband is a pretty technical area, and one of the goals of the conversation today is to cover some of the terminology, the data, the mapping tools, and the other inputs that are a critical part of ensuring that these investments get made. However, I want to emphasize another important theme that's been part of our conference conversation so far and really is central to the work that we're all committed to doing. One of our digital navigator partners, I think, Carlos Ortega from Elevate CCIC, is in the room today. We were having a conversation, and he started by saying, I want to thank you for connecting me to. And in this case, it was a new partner relationship that's leading to new ways for Elevate to elevate their mission. And what we like to say at Rural LISC is that our network, our local community partners, are the human infrastructure moving digital infrastructure forward. So as technical as the broadband space may be, it really is about building relationships and partnerships, and so much of the new funding, the $42 billion that I referenced from NTIA through the Department of Commerce, is oriented towards local engagement, building stakeholder relationships, centralizing what local communities value in sort of the as the critical questions that then lead to that infrastructure deployment. So we're going to hear a lot more about it. And I'd first like to ask Brian to check that his microphone's working and
can everybody hear me?
I believe it is further. Working. Excellent.
Indeed. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Brian Rathbone from Broadband Catalyst, and I'm really glad to be talking a little bit about this digital equity origin story. It's not a story I get to tell very often. But one of the reasons I am so passionate about digital equity is that I was the guy who needed it. I almost died when I was 16. I got kicked out of high school. I ended up homeless. It was a very difficult time for me. And I ended up getting a job at a corporation and working my way up from the mailroom. But even then, I had an interest in computers and technology. And I remember going to a vice president of the company and said, I'd really love it if you'd help me a little bit with some education. I'd like to learn more. And he said, no, you're too stupid. We're not going to invest in you. And I ended up having to take it upon myself. And one day my boss said, take those old 10 computers and throw them in the dumpster. And I said, well, can I fix them? And he laughed at me, but I'm a farmer. I used to train racehorses. I have that farmer logic. So I used farmer logic and I fixed 8 of those computers. And I kept one for myself and I gave the other 7 away. And that started a trend. I probably fixed 300-400 computers over the years. And then I went and I started taking classes. But when the internet came around, that was when I realized I could teach myself using the internet. And that is how my career started. So I became a technology developer and I worked as a technology integrator for NASCAR teams, for Martin Marietta, for lots of really big companies. And I ended up becoming the vice president of research and development for a .com in the late 90s. And it was a really interesting experience for me. I didn't like living in the city. I was a country boy. And I got the opportunity to work from home full time. And I thought, this is perfect. I'm going to move out to rural North Carolina. I'm going to find a home that has internet access, and I'm going to get to live my dream. So I bought a house in 2002. My real estate agent said, no problem. You got cable, you got DSL, you got wireless, you're good to go. So I bought the house. I couldn't get any of those services. The cable stopped a quarter of a mile up the road, and it was $30,000 to extend it. The DSL actually was there, but it was only 24 ports for the whole neighborhood, and it was full. So I sat on a waiting list for 15 years. And the wireless was blocked by trees on my neighbor's property. So I couldn't even solve it with a chainsaw, although I was tempted. Eventually, he clear-cut the property and did get it. But for many years, living in that home, I was spending $800 a month for less than 1 megabit service. That's slower than the lowest DSL service that you can get. And I saw the impact it was having on me, on my community. When we lost our manufacturing capacity in the community, our unemployment rate was 16-17%. And we started teaching farmers how to sell their crops before they ever pulled them out of the field. So understanding that connectivity to the internet goes a long way towards empowering education and job growth and telemedicine and all of these other things. Those were the things that really caused me to be passionate about this. And so I ended up working at the North Carolina State Broadband Initiative for 4 years after the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act provided that funding. And afterwards, I went back to the private sector and was approached by the Appalachian Regional Commission, the EPA, and USDA about creating broadband toolkits and then going out and doing technical assistance across the country. And it was during that work that I found that the problem I had was not unique in any way, shape, or form to me. And so I'm going to talk more in my presentation about that embedded digital inequity. Sometimes your neighbors will have all the service they need, but you don't have what you need. And that's what I want to talk about today.
Sure. Awesome. Hi, everyone. It is great to be here, and Christa, I just want to put you on the spot too. I have for our whole time of knowing each other, anytime I've ever had any, question about, broadband mumbo jumbo, Christa's been my go-to resource. So it is an honor to hear you now on this panel say that you look to us, because, that's quite a feat. But my name is Benya Kraus Beacom. I'm one of the co-founders of Lead for America. Let me begin first by saying I call home a mix of Bangkok, Thailand, and Wasika, Minnesota. So my mom grew up in northern Thailand farming mangoes. Her dad was the dean of the agricultural school in northern Thailand, and my dad grew up on our family farm. It's now in their 6th generation of farming corn and soy, but a generation ago, everything but ducks, they say. And they somehow met and had my brother and me in Thailand. And I grew up in the big metropolis of Bangkok for most of my life until a college student was brought back to Wasika for one summer. I'd always spent my Christmases and my summers visiting my 53 first cousins on my dad's side on the family farm. But this summer kind of exposed me now, as a young adult to actually what was the possibility and the depth of commitment and care and history and innovation that was taking place in rural America. So I, with an international relations degree, decided that actually, once I graduated from my university in Boston, I was going to come back to Minnesota, only to really find that coming back to, a place that at the time, wasn't Boston, New York, or DC as a young 22-year-old was actually kind of difficult. There were no, career centers telling me, how to forge that pathway back. I was applying to fellowship programs that were trying to export talent out to, other countries or these amazing research fellowships. But the conversation was always, how do we get you out? As opposed to this idea of how do we get talent back in, and that coming home was also a worthy path to be celebrated. So in some ways, a little bit of a selfish reason, I and 4 other co-founders from Kansas, Oklahoma, Eastern North Carolina, Kentucky, and Minnesota, we decided that, we wanted to create an organization that both could get us back home, but also usher in a generation of leaders that saw promise and opportunity and celebration in homecoming. And so that is the idea behind Lead for America. And we have now grown the organization from a group of 420-somethings to now a national organization. We've brought on veterans in the AmeriCorps National Service space to create what is the largest national service fellowship program supporting economic prosperity in rural and what we call legacy cities all across the country. In that work, I came across, I came across personally the challenge of moving to Waseca, Minnesota, as someone who was fully part of a remote organization and trying to find digital connectivity and access to broadband. And as we tried to encourage a whole generation of people to move back to their rural communities, that was one of the cornerstone challenges of how do you actually scale and support talent in returning back home. And so saw that if we are to do anything around economic development and rural prosperity, we really had to tackle this digital divide. At the same time that we were seeing this play out in our own cohort of fellows, Land O'Lakes launched this initiative called the American Connection Project Coalition. It was a coalition of over 100 companies that advocated for the $65 billion to pass in the infrastructure law towards broadband and digital adoption efforts. And so during that time, we created this track within our fellowship program to focus on bringing homecomers back to their rural communities to build the capacity locally to go after those dollars. And in that process, got to know Christa and the amazing Rural LISC team, tap into their amazing network of digital navigators so that we weren't building it all from scratch. Amazing technical experts like the National Digital Inclusion Alliance and the whole kind of ecosystem of digital adoption leaders helped us design this fellowship program that now is our signature program at Lead for America, which is the American Connection Core. We've expanded now from going just broadband to all the different kind of, whether it's economic development, health and social capital, and agriculture and natural resources, extra capacity on all those fronts, but also still promoting this national campaign of digital divide. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's how we came into this work and now support. Next year, we'll have 250 fellows building local grassroots capacity to go after these dollars. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm Jerry Kinney with the T.L.L. Temple Foundation. And Christa, thanks a lot for having us on this panel. The T.L.L. Temple Foundation is a private family philanthropy. So we're a place-based philanthropy, and we serve 22 rural counties in East Texas. So if you think about the Texas-Arkansas border down the Louisiana line to the coast is what we serve. It's an area about the size of South Carolina. So it's very large. And philanthropy, we've had discussions here today about the role of philanthropy. So I'll get into a bit more during the slides about, but it can be lonely out there. There's not a lot of rural philanthropy. So really have an obligation to figure out how to invest in our communities. And our mission at the T.L.L. Temple Foundation is to build a thriving rural East Texas. And the quick route as to why I'm here and why we're doing this work is there is no scenario in which we have a thriving rural East Texas without high-speed broadband that's accessible and available to all of our rural communities. And so that's really sets at the heart, particularly after COVID, on why we need to do this. And I guess my rural why am I passionate about rural development work? I'm from rural East Texas, rural Northeast Texas, outside of a town called Mount Pleasant. I now live with my family in Lufkin, Texas, which is in deep East Texas. That distinction doesn't mean a lot to y'all. It's very important in East Texas to say I'm from Northeast Texas. I live in deep East Texas. So that's important, important there. In terms of growing up, I think something that Benya said that was really important, and the narrative that when I grew up that continues to exist today is success equals leaving. For a lot of our young people and a lot of our champions and risk takers, success, even when the schools bring people back to say, talk to your alumni, it's usually people who left. And that narrative is damaging to our rural communities. And we have to change that, which is part of why broadband sets at the center of saying, do we have the types of communities where young people can make a difference, where people can come back home, revitalize and build the rural communities? And that's what really this is about. So listening to that narrative, I was one that left. Growing up on, we had 100 acres, had cows, and we didn't have ducks either, but we had some crops and had some animals. My real rural bona fide that is really the peak is I had the grand champion steer at the Titus County Fair in 1994. It doesn't really get any bigger. Thank you. Yes, it doesn't get any bigger than that. It all goes downhill from there in the rural space. So, my dad was a coal miner, and when the coal stack fell, he drove trucks with the CDL to keep food on the table. My mom was a teacher. These sorts of jobs and really looking back on what automation has done and economic degradation, and really what does a thriving future look like in rural areas? That's at the heart of why we're doing this work. And it involves broadband and the intersection of broadband with all the other things that are happening in rural places. So, really grateful to have the chance to leave. Did a lot of work, joined the Peace Corps, spent 2.5 years in Armenia, then did a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa on capacity building, humanitarian work. And I think a lot of that coming back home and taking those lessons and bringing them back to the domestic context is really important, because at the heart of all of this sits capacity. So I look forward to unpacking a bit about how we're defining it, how we're investing in it, but really grateful to be here. And I'm trying to get used to the word around innovation in East Texas. That's never really, but yeah, we're there. I mean, we have a lot of really neat stuff happening in East Texas. So thanks.
Well, thank you all. And I'd love to invite Zaki to unmute and share a little bit about how you came into digital equity work. And then I'll pass it back to Brian to start us off on our presentations.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me. Sorry that I'm not with you, but I'm also glad to be demonstrating the importance of digital equity in real time by joining you remotely from across the country. My name is Zaki Barzinji. I work at the Aspen Institute, where I'm the senior director of a portfolio of work called Empowered Communities. So I lead a range of projects at the intersection of tech, equity, justice, and representation for underserved and marginalized communities, which take many forms in many ways. My own journey to digital equity, specifically as it pertains to rural communities, is I grew up in Northern Virginia, the son of immigrants, and I saw digital inequity in a entirely different way among the communities that I grew up in, communities who did not have digital literacy, who didn't know how to access, who had access technically, but did not have the skills or the connections to be able to use that digital access to truly compete on a equal playing field with others who were more or less digital natives compared to my own family members. And then when I got my start in government, serving in the governor of Virginia's office in Richmond, Virginia. And this wasn't that long ago, but it was at a time when nobody really knew what tech policy was in the governor's office. So I was able to talk myself into being the head of tech policy for the governor at the age of 23, because no one else knew what that meant. And it ended up taking me all across Virginia, well past the areas that I was used to. And so I went down to Southwest Virginia to visit communities there. And there were so many communities, especially in that area, that have been deeply impacted by essentially vanishing industries like the tobacco industry in particular. And those communities tend to be the most cut off from the rest of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And it's truly like a different world down there. And so that's where I really saw up close and in person the effect, the different versions and strains of what digital inequity can look like. And it also taught me, sorry, I'm in a place where I just got the light turned off. It really showed me that, communities can look very different than the one I grew up in. But at the end of the day, the impact of inequity, digital inequity, is the same. It means your community is otherized. It means you are kept from the same types of opportunities and economic success that other communities are. So whether you're a rural community in Southwest Virginia or an immigrant community in Northern Virginia, you still face the same types of barriers, or at least the same impacts that can come out of not having access and not being connected. So I spent the rest of my career since then focusing on the intersection of access to technology and to digital infrastructure, as well as the intersection with that and underserved, underrepresented communities. And so at Aspen now, my job is to put people together in rooms that otherwise would never talk to each other. And so a little bit later, I'll share some of the learnings that we've had by bringing together folks from different types of impacted communities to share lessons learned with each other and to really see the commonality behind the impact of not having access to digital literacy, digital skills, and the technology and infrastructure needed to actually take advantage of them. So thanks for having me.
Okay, well, thank you again, everybody. And again, my name is Brian Rathbone with Broadband Catalysts. And I'm going to start talking about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, that was passed on November 15th in 2021. This bipartisan act provides $1.2 trillion in federal spending over 5 years. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the individual programs that are within the IIJA. So the one that we're most familiar with, most people have heard about, is BEAD, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. Got away from me there. There we go. Which provides $42.45 billion to expand high-speed internet access by funding planning, infrastructure, deployment, and adoption programs. In my technical assistance work right now, this is where most of the energy is focused, is on helping communities get ready to write grants for the BEAD program to deploy broadband infrastructure in those communities that and in those areas that do not have it. And fortunately, now we're down to the address level, so it's no longer the census block or the hexagon. We're funding addresses. So that's taken us a lot farther to where we want to be from previous programs. Then we have the Enabling Middle Mile Broadband Infrastructure Program. This program has closed, but it did provide $1 billion to expand the middle mile infrastructure. And for those who are not familiar with the middle mile infrastructure, the internet is made up of 3 mile designations. The first mile are your data centers, your major fiber routes, your backbones. One Marietta in Atlanta, Georgia is a perfect example of the first mile. The middle mile are these fiber optic superhighways that go out and they literally run along our highways in many cases that connect the first mile to most ISPs. And then the ISPs, the internet service providers themselves, whose job it is to take that wholesale middle mile infrastructure and deliver it to residences, they're building out the last mile. So this middle mile program was to build out those major internet fiber optic superhighways that connect the middle mile and the ISPs delivering the last mile. The Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, this was one that was funded originally with $2.1 billion. That portion of the program has closed, but round 2 is now open, and applications are due on January 23rd of 2024. Not a lot of time left to get those grant applications in, but if there's anybody here or listening who's working with tribes, I highly recommend you get an application in, even if it's not as well developed as you would like. Get it in, get your chance to get some funding, because otherwise you're going to miss out on this particular opportunity. And again, that program provides a total of $3 billion across the two different rounds. There's $900 million, I think it's $980 million in this round two, and it is to be used for broadband deployment on tribal lands, as well as telehealth, distance learning, broadband affordability, and digital inclusion. So it goes well beyond just the wires that connect the home, so to speak. The Digital Equity Act, I think you're going to hear quite a bit about today, because I think Benya is going to talk a little bit about that too. But the program itself is intended to promote digital inclusion and equity. And the State Digital Equity Planning Grant Program has $60 million. The State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program is $1.44 billion. And the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program is $1.25 billion. And then there's the Distance Learning, Telemedicine, and Broadband Program. It's a $2 billion program that will be appropriated for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Utilities Service, under which recipients are obligated to utilize $5 million of their award for the establishment and growth of cooperatives to offer broadband. Now, there's more information about the IIJA and these different programs on the Internet for All website. We've got some materials that we've printed out. We don't have enough for everybody, but if you're very interested in this, please see us after the panel. We've got some printouts that we can share with you that go into a little bit more detail of what these programs offer, or you can go to the Broadband for All website or NTIA's website and get more information about those. Before I move on to talk a little bit, are we saving all the questions for last?
I just want to acknowledge one of our partners was a recipient of the first round of the tribal broadband program. The Mississippi Choctaw won $8 million to do everything that was listed in that menu of opportunity, from expanding connectivity to promoting digital adoption and workforce development. So these dollars are definitely going to work in rural communities. So I wanted to share that.
Absolutely. So we can save the questions for the Q&A section, and I'm going to go now and talk a little bit more. Oh, actually, I forgot the Affordable Connectivity Fund. This one is an important conversation because the Affordable Connectivity Fund is an extension of the FCC program to provide direct subsidies to qualified households for the purchase of broadband service. And the Affordable Connectivity Fund will receive an appropriation of $4.2 billion. Now, that appropriation has passed, and we are rapidly running out of money for this program. At this point, it's going to run out probably mid-2024. So if we do not see an additional appropriation for the Affordable Connectivity Fund, we are going to find that is going to increase our digital equity issues, especially from an affordability standpoint. And if you're on tribal lands, there's actually twice as much subsidy. It's $35 a month for non-tribal recipients. But if you're on tribal lands, it is $70 a month for that internet. And there is a $99 one-time, essentially a stipend to receive a device. And this is extremely important when you're talking about digital equity. If you don't have the connectivity, if you can't afford the connectivity, and you don't have a device, there's absolutely no way you're going to be able to fully take advantage of the digital economy. Now, there are other issues. Do you know how to use the device? Do you understand what the digital economy has to offer you? Many of the households that have been non-adopters in the past don't feel the need to adopt. So when we're deploying new infrastructure in rural areas, in traditionally underserved areas, one of the reasons the ISPs have been reticent to go there is that the uptake is traditionally low. So it's very important for us to include digital equity and other programs to help people get to that point that they understand why it's valuable to them, that they can afford it, that they can have a device they can use it on and get that benefit. So now I want to talk about something I'm very passionate about. And everything I'm going to talk about from here on out was very much informed with the work that I did with the USDA's Rural Development Services, the EPA's Office of Sustainable Communities, and the Appalachian Regional Commission. And they sent us to 18 different communities around the country to provide technical assistance. But I got to tell you, I learned so much from that program. And every single time we went to a community, we would do a tour. And they would all laugh at me because I'd spend the whole tour looking at their telephone poles, looking at their cell towers, trying to crane my neck and see their water towers because it's all digital infrastructure. And that was one of the big lessons for me, is the fact that you can quite often visually identify broadband infrastructure. And you can also visually identify embedded digital inequity. It's not a term I use very often, but essentially I was one of these households, and my neighbors were among these households, where an area might have broadband infrastructure, but it doesn't serve all of the homes. In just about every town that we went to in Cool and Connected, I could find a street where there was cable infrastructure on one side of the street, and there were usually more affluent houses on that side of the street. And on the other side of the street, you'd see homes that had no cable infrastructure, no fiber, and they'd all have satellite dishes. And this home you see right here, how hard was it for me to find this? I made it right out of my driveway and went a quarter of a mile. This house that you see has no fewer than 3 satellite dishes connected to it. And this is one of the parts of digital inequity that doesn't get discussed very much, because directly across the street, there's cable service and fiber service, and it's cheaper. This household is paying more for their television and internet and getting lower quality service than their more affluent neighbors across the street, who just happen to be lucky enough to have that infrastructure there. So you might say to yourself, well, how much could it really cost to take the fiber or the cable across the street? And on average, it's between $15,000 and $25,000. And so if you can't get everybody on the other side of the street to subscribe at the same time, which is usually what happened when they deployed it in the first place, they're not going to build it. Now, here's the worst part. Those homes are considered served. If you look at the FCC's broadband data, that house is not listed as unserved, and that house is not going to get any money to fix the problem unless somebody raises their hand and says, here are the addresses that are unserved. This is really difficult. They're everywhere. And I'm going to show you there's some communities that we've been looking at in our work with LISC, where Jerry lives in Lufkin. I'm going to show you an example of this. So I wanted to make the point that even though we're showing all these areas as served, it doesn't mean that they are. And here's the worst part of it. If this home wanted to get connected to broadband and wanted to report themselves as unserved, the only way that they're actually going to determine that they're unserved is to order the service, which means they have to be able to afford it and they have to know that they want it. So if this household remains silent and they don't say anything before this money comes out, they're not going to get service anytime soon. And I want to make sure that we're thinking about these things and doing the best that we can to provide challenges to the FCC's broadband mapping, which is excellent. It is much better than it was, but it is still deeply flawed. And we are tying billions of broadband dollars of investment to these maps. So if they're inaccurate, now is the time to say something, and now is the time to work within our own communities, because as you'll see through this presentation, it's everywhere. We can't just go to the unserved areas and focus on them, because it's everywhere, even in urban areas, which I will discuss a little bit more. This is the infrastructure directly across the street from the house. I know it's probably a little bit difficult to see, but this is where I've learned to visually identify cable infrastructure and fiber infrastructure as it attaches to the pole. Not something I expect everybody to do, but it is possible. And so once I finished looking in my own community, I jumped onto Google Earth and I started going to the communities that we've been researching, going to Lufkin, Texas. It never took me more than 5 minutes to find a household within those communities that was an example of this digital inequity. Here's one in Coachella Valley. You can see the center circle is the satellite dish. There's cable infrastructure on 3 sides of this house, but it's not close enough. And therefore, the cost to hook up that house, just by my estimates, about $5,000. It is generally $10 to $15 per foot if you're more than 250 feet from the infrastructure. I have a 750-foot driveway. It cost me $10,000 to get fiber hooked up. That is not something that the average household is going to do unless they have a really good reason like me. That's how I do my job. But for most households, that's just out of reach. If we look at Diboll, Texas, This is a set of railroad tracks. Jerry, I'm betting you know which railroad tracks I'm talking about because I've heard you mention them and I had no trouble finding them. And these railroad tracks represent both the proverbial barrier, if you live on the wrong side of the tracks, but they're also a physical barrier. Crossing railroad tracks costs more than crossing the street. There's permitting. You have to deal with the railroad owners. And so the people who live on the other side of these tracks right now are unserved. And these are two of the houses. And I invited my friend Leo to point something out here. Because these two houses are directly across from that those railroad tracks. And they do not have any broadband infrastructure. However, does anybody know what that white marker with the orange top is? That's a fiber marker. There's fiber in their front yard. And this is where we have to accept the fact that many of these problems we do to ourselves structurally. That fiber is owned by the local phone company, and they do not want other ISPs using that fiber to compete with them to provide last mile broadband access. So in general, that fiber that's running right through our unserved areas can be inaccessible. That makes the problem worse. This is in Lufkin, Texas. This home is within 1,000 feet of cable infrastructure. You can see the satellite dish connected to the front. Again, it's probably $5,000, $6,000 to hook up that home. And you might say, well, there's plenty of money coming down with BEAD, but as I mentioned before, it's not going to get allocated to these folks because they're in an area that's indicated as served. And the cable company has absolutely zero incentive to let the federal government know that that home is unserved. In fact, there's been a rule that if you can serve a home within 10 business days, you can count it as served. You don't have to be connected to it. You don't have to be providing service there now, just if you can reasonably do it within 10 days. But there's nothing in there that says, what if it costs $5,000? What if it costs $10,000? We really haven't accounted for these digital inequities and how they're affecting all of our neighborhoods. This particular one in Highlands, Texas, another community that we've been looking at, that not only has digital inequity, but is unlikely to be a recipient of BEAD funds for these areas. This particular home has an aerial TV. So at least I'll give it to them. They're not spending 2 to 3 times as much to watch television. But nonetheless, they are without infrastructure, and the providers have been loath to go provide that infrastructure because they're not even sure if they want it. So if you don't lead infrastructure programs with digital equity, digital inclusion, telemedicine, free public Wi-Fi is something else that we see. If you give people the opportunity to understand why the internet is beneficial to them in their lives, then they are much more inclined to become an adopter. And I want to mention one other community that I went to. I don't have a screenshot for this one, but it was the most frustrating thing that I did during the Cool and Connected program. Most of the places we went were communities in West Virginia, in Alabama, and other places where the infrastructure did not exist and the money didn't exist. This was like 2016 to 2018 that we were doing that. And so most of the time I had to tell people, you don't have the infrastructure you need. The infrastructure you need is going to cost $10, $20 million, and I don't know where to tell you to get that money. Things have changed. Now there is the money to do that. But I learned an important lesson in Carrizozo, New Mexico. Before I went to Carrizozo, I was so excited because 80% of the structures were connected to fiber to the home. And I thought, this is wonderful. I actually get to tell people, talk to people about what you do with it once you have it. How does it benefit your life? And I got to Carrizozo and I could not find a single person connected to that network, not one. The only place that was connected to the network in the entire community was a restaurant, and people went there to use their Wi-Fi. The kids would gather outside the closed gates of the school in the morning to use the school's Wi-Fi to do their homework. And so I started asking really uncomfortable questions. Why is this? And what I realized was that the median income in Carrizozo, New Mexico was $20,000 a year. And the fiber had been subsidized as part of the telephone network. So you had to subscribe to the landline telephone service and the fiber service, which had a minimum cost of $100 a month. That infrastructure was useless, and it broke my heart. I was very fortunate to meet with their phone company, and they were a locally owned phone company. They were very passionate. They overbuilt their own fiber with fixed wireless so they could offer lower cost plans so that the community could start to understand how to afford it, how to either save enough money or make enough money with their internet connection that it made sense for them to do it. Because otherwise, they were completely, utterly disconnected and frankly disgusted. And so I was really happy to see that that telephone company not only put up the fixed wireless, but they also put up public Wi-Fi to allow those kids to do their homework. That's a lot of what this stuff comes down to. We're disadvantaging our own children unintentionally, and we're spending money that doesn't always fix the problem. So I just wanted everybody to be aware of those nuances that we face. So when we start talking about why is digital equity important, this is why it's important. Now, I spent most of my time with the North Carolina Digital Infrastructure Office at the North Carolina Rural Center, working with the EPA and the Cool and Connect program. A lot of my work came around mapping broadband infrastructure. And I mentioned before that our mapping of broadband infrastructure is dramatically improved. We used to just do census block level. And frankly, still the public data is census block level, but we can get down to those addresses. This map is what we start to use to do gap analysis. Where do we think it's missing? Where should you survey your communities? Any of those census blocks you see in bright red are almost entirely unserved with 25 down, 3 up broadband, which is the FCC's current definition of broadband. If you don't have 25 megabits download speed and 3 megabits upload speed, you have internet connectivity, but you do not have broadband. And then those in orange are underserved. They don't have 100 down, 20 up. And all of the little pins that you see there are community anchor institutions. They're government facilities, they're schools. All the gray pins are the cell towers. These are the different types of infrastructure that we can use to address these digital inequity problems, identifying where the libraries are, where the disconnected areas are right next to those libraries. All of those things factor into decisions. And this is the type of work that we do in helping communities get ready to apply for the BEAD grants. You need to be able to show locationally where you're going to apply those funds, where the problems are, and that's all a part of this process. So again, my name is Brian Rathbone. I thank you all very much for your time, and I'll be happy to ask any questions at the end.
Thank you, Brian. I think a lot of people are going to be looking up.
Woo!
So.
Look at the telephone poles. Look at your telephone poles. Look at your cell towers. Look at your water towers. If you want to know where the broadband is, look up.
Right. Well, that was a good tutorial. Benya, if you could take us a little further on adoption and our network of partnerships that will get us there.
Yeah. Woo! All right, Brian. It's a tall task to go after you, but I'm like ready to like jump up and start a rallying cry now after that. And also, yeah, my husband and I are looking at getting an acreage to start the small farm, and we're trying to find a spot that has internet connection. So can you please come on our house search with us? Well, hi everyone. Benya, Kraus, Beacom, with Lead for America, and Lead for America is the umbrella organization that supports what is our signature digital adoption program, the American Connection Corps. So first, before I go into what our program is, Brian teed me up well to talk about the Digital Equity Act. So the Digital Equity Act, as Brian said, $2.75 billion to fund these 3 programs that are available to communities. So the first chunk, it's already been distributed. It's the Digital Equity Planning Grant, $60 million. Every single state, Native Nation, and the territories received a planning grant to essentially be able to say, what are your opportunities, obstacles, barriers, who are the players already locally doing digital equity work, to understand what is your state or your area's specific landscape for digital equity. So that funding was already distributed. I think, every state has a version of their state digital equity plan finished up. It's due. It's due at the anyway. Yeah. But interesting with that, if you're not plugged in with your state digital equity planning process, they are also required to do a public comment period. And, I'll speak a little bit from Minnesota. We had a former librarian lead our state digital equity planning process. She's amazing. And yes, she wears like a cardigan, a typical librarian. But she's taken on such an intentional, very personalized focus. And they did an incredible job, I will say, of documenting as much as they can across the state. During the public comment period, though, the public television networks came forward and said, actually, we find ourselves missing from your plan because for people to access us, this is a digital equity issue. And we also show, we have data to show, too, that when people have access to public TV, they're more civically engaged. And that's for a lot of residents how they, get an awareness of economic opportunities, civic engagement opportunities in the region. So all that to say, these digital equity plans are meant to be personalized to what your state, your area is looking at. And it's an opportunity for organizations that might not typically see themselves as a digital equity activator to really be able to step up and say, we can be part of the solution too. So that's my rundown on the digital equity planning grants. Now, from those grants is then how the federal government's going to determine the formula funding that will go to states to fund those digital inclusion and equity activities. So the states will likely regrant a lot of this money to local organizations that are doing work or would like to do work on making sure that everyone has both the affordability, the understanding of how to use the internet and have the devices to be able to access it as well. The third funding program here, and this is $1.25 billion, this is competitive grants. So now, that first program, the digital equity capacity grants, that's flowing through the states. This is an opportunity for organizations to apply for funding in coalition or directly to the federal government to say, we are doing, sometimes cross-state work around digital equity and inclusion, and that's another opportunity to get funding. So again, that's the rundown on funding coming through. A big challenge in all of this, right, is you can hear from Brian's pictures that quite literally to understand who has access, who doesn't, and why, it is a house by house, door knocking campaign, trust building campaign, and sustained relationships that need to be tethered to a local, I think, advocate or local community quarterback. We also then find that there's a huge lack of capacity for local organizations and communities to be able to do that grassroots door-to-door work to understand actually in your own neighborhood, how is this affecting you? And so this was the challenge we saw. And we thought that national service can and should and must be part of the solution to make sure that our local capacity is anchored to the people that the community already trust. And so thus was formed the American Connection Corps. We are a national AmeriCorps program that's focused on building local capacity and advancing economic prosperity in rural and what we call legacy communities nationwide. I'm married into Iowa, so I joke with my husband that Des Moines, yes, is a legacy community. He's from Des Moines. But a huge part of our ethos at the American Connection Corps is that we focus on connecting people to places to help them see their possibility. A little bit of our track record to date. The American Connection Corps, we were launched in 2021, like I mentioned, with the leadership of Land O'Lakes and the American Connection Project Coalition. You can see some of our initial founding group of sponsors to help bring this core alive. We began with 75 ACC members deployed across initially 12 states. Since then, those members have helped their communities get access to $45 million of infrastructure and digital equity funding. They are hosting digital skill building workshops in their own local communities. They're forming these broadband action teams that are bringing together cross-sector organizations in their community to say, okay, how do we advance digital equity and come up with a mission statement for what we want digital equity to look like for our place. I mentioned too, right, that the American Connection Corps, the digital divide is a core campaign of ours, but we see it and we frame it as a larger way of addressing economic prosperity. So our members are also working and hosted at agencies that are focused on advancing community and economic development, ag and natural resources, health and social capital, so providing capacity for those other issue areas. But what we do with our training education, we bring them together 4 times in person every year, is also understanding that you don't have to be an existing digital equity or digital skills provider in order to do digital equity work. So there's a vast variety of organizations that agree to host ACC members, both to advance their own initiatives around, workforce development. But through our training program, we help every organization see that they are part of the solution to tackling the digital divide. So we've been really inspired by a lot of the rural LISC model of working with affordable housing developers, of how to make sure that when you're building affordable housing, that digital equity is also at the center of delivering that, and that your wraparound social service providers are also understanding that, when they're doing intake assessments of people coming in, and they might be coming in because they're trying to get a job, but how can you also maybe ask them questions to understand what is their own, maybe personal challenge or obstacle to getting internet access, and being, equipped to be able to deliver the slate of resources in order to get them connected. So that's, those examples are a little bit of, when we talk about access to connection, these are the things that our members will be working on. Many of them are doing the house to house to house to farm to business walk through, building connections and relationships with those people, understanding whether there's specific barriers, looking up and seeing what infrastructure exists. Many of them are working on mapping initiatives and preparing with their county government the support, the public support needed to get the match dollars to be able to compete at the state level for the infrastructure funding coming in. But beyond infrastructure is also, how can these communities be equipped with the capacity to go after those 3 grant programs that I mentioned? Here's a little bit about our footprint real quick. We started off with being in 12 states, and we've now expanded this year to 29 states and have more than 100 members currently in the field now. Next year, we'll be looking at doubling that to 250. So if you don't see your community or state on here, know that our goal is all 50 states. So would love to connect and figure out how to work together on that. Which gets at here. Sorry, the formatting is a little strange here, but what next? As I mentioned, community partnerships. We are actively searching and recruiting host sites now. We're also looking at partners who can help us with our AmeriCorps recruitment. We've seen a lot of great success in working with schools on who are trying to figure out ways to keep their talent and get them engaged in community development efforts. So if you're that kind of organization, we're excited to work with you. And then finally, funding the gap here. So as a national service program, we're able to bring in AmeriCorps funding, and we administer all the back end complexity of dealing with a federal grant. And so any host organization doesn't need to do that. We will hold the grant for you so that you don't have to, have 10 to 15 members at any one time. We can support you with 1 member, but then we also bring in philanthropic support to match that as well. And then finally here, I also wanted to share a really exciting what's next that we're working on with rural LISC. So with the generous support of the Comcast Foundation, have rolled out a Train the Trainer program, which is essentially a Rolodex of resources and technical assistance, templates of what we are learning when, our members and the digital navigators at rural LISC are getting other community organizations to be activated and understanding how they can deploy digital navigator programs in their own communities. We are in the process right now of rolling that all up into a list of templates and resources that even if you're an organization that isn't hosting a member, but you're trying to figure out how can you bring digital equity into your own organizations, this is envisioned as a toolkit to be able to support you in rolling that out so you don't have to start from scratch. And lastly, as well, if you're interested in becoming a host site, know of an organization that might, here's some information on that as well.
Benya, I'd love to take a moment and talk about another way that we've partnered. So Lead for America has a lot of talent and has built a template letter for nonprofits, you in the audience, our network of partners, to submit to their state broadband office to comment on these Digital Equity Act plans that are currently in draft form. And as Benya said, the deadlines are rolling and are dependent on when the state initially received their planning grant, but all these plans will ultimately be submitted to NTIA in the first quarter of next year. LFA's team is reading these plans and seeing our organizations named respectively in our network partners, seeing our values sort of lifted up, what we've learned from the digital navigation program, who can really kind of operationalize this work to build capacity. This is about broadband and it's about inclusion, but I think so much it's about the capacity of nonprofits. And we have really reflected a lot on how deeply rooted organizations, no matter what their focus or mission might be, can really carry forward this work. And as was said earlier by Mark Kudlowitz, this is one-time money. So my point here is that we're reading these plans, we're offering a template letter to encourage our member organizations, our network partners, to submit letters, to score using a rubric that we've generated, obviously can add to it. What is the content of these plans? So many state broadband offices were standing up for the first time, right? You couldn't receive these monies from NTIA unless you create a broadband office. And, we know that some of the kind of thinking about how to deploy this work just from reading these plans and being engaged at that state and local level is that, this is new work to carry forward. And so I would very much encourage, if you're interested in stepping into this work, to ask me or Benya about our template letter, or Kimberly Lawrenceburg, I see in the back, has an amazing story to share about not only submitting a letter to the state broadband office in South Dakota and having that well received, but to be in a conversation where their example of leading through digital inclusion has been a talking point for the state as they try to bring other regions around South Dakota into this work. So we are making a difference right now locally. I just want to appreciate Lead for America and the capacity, the human capacity you have to read 50 plans, which is just like 10,000 pages or something, but it's great. So let's stay connected. We're better together to get this work done, but thank you for that moment. And Jerry, if you can tie us together even more effectively, right, about how it's going to take partnerships to get it done.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So I think we went really hyper local with looking up in the sky at a particular house, and then we went sort of about capacity and coming back home. So I'm going to zoom out a bit on setting up really the ecosystem for how we do this work in a rural area. So one of the really neat things to see is East Texas represented in both. So Brian talking about the digital disconnect and our broadband disconnection in East Texas, but also there's one spot in Texas where your dot popped up, and it's East Texas, and there's a reason for all of that. So I want to get into why. So I'll start with just setting the current rural context. We've heard a lot already on the first bullet on all the unprecedented historic dollars that are coming down that are now available for rural communities. But first, I'm reminded of a time I was at a conference in San Antonio, and the mayor got up and he was talking about how he's doing this all hands on deck effort across his administration to pull down every dollar that could possibly be available for San Antonio, which is absolutely what they should do. Then I was just reminded of how our rural communities simply can't do that. We don't have a bureaucracy and layers to bring everybody together and create a task force and pull down all of these dollars. And so, the inequity is already baked into some of this. And so I want to talk about just quickly three barriers, three buckets of capacity constraints that we like to talk about. And it starts the first with staffing. So just the staffing barrier facing our rural communities. And we use the acronym STP, and it stands for the same two people. And in these rural communities, it's the same two folks, and you keep coming back. And we actually did a network analysis when we were trying to scale up a healthcare partnership. And you wouldn't be surprised to find that the people working on expanding healthcare access are the same people working on broadband, are the same people working on education, are the same people working on economic development, are the same people. Like, it's the same. So you can't have an exhausted infrastructure, civic infrastructure, and just keep loading additional responsibilities onto that. So we have to talk a bit about how to, okay, within that first bucket, what do we do about that? Second bucket is technical expertise. And in terms of these buckets, some of this work comes from analysis done in Oregon with the Ford Family Foundation and their group. But technical expertise, I was talking to Brian before this, like 5 years ago, pre-COVID, he was talking about, like, there was no rural broadband experts. You were about to shut down your shop, you said. Now all of a sudden we need Brian literally everywhere. So, like, how do, we don't have the funding to put a broadband expert in every small community. So what does the distributed network look like? How do we need them at a regional level at least? And how do we set that up? So technical expertise, and we need that across every single area that our rural communities are dealing with. That's housing, that's broadband. So again, all of these things simultaneously. The third, resources. We've heard a lot about the money coming down, but we also need matching funds. We also need pre-development dollars. And so those three buckets, staffing, technical expertise, and resources, is what we're trying to get at and continue to plug away as we're thinking about building out these systems in rural places. The other thing is, a lot of times we've heard, well, why doesn't philanthropy, do more in rural? And I want to just start out with, this chart comes from the St. Louis Fed report. And there is a wide inequity in terms of how many philanthropic dollars come into rural communities. And so if the figure there talks about $451 as the per capita average in the US, and some of the urban areas are getting over $4,000. When we're talking about some of our rural communities are getting less than 50. I mean, like, we're not even close. So I just want to set out, as a rural philanthropy that's relatively large, based in a rural community that does all rural all day, it gets lonely out here. I mean, there's not a lot of rural focused philanthropy. So we're talking about models of engagement, models of investment. We're in the early stages. We're trying to figure it out, but there's not a lot of models to follow. We don't have a playbook yet on what this looks like. So a few lessons here is we have to be catalytic, and I keep catalytic. These are billion-dollar challenges, and we have millions, and there's no million-dollar solution to billion-dollar challenges. You can look at what Brian's talking about, connecting. We could spend all of our money connecting one community. Or do we fix the water system in one community? Or do we try to provide post-secondary access and scholarships? These are the dilemmas we're dealing with. So we need new models of operating philanthropy different in rural communities. And it's about that braiding and layering and blending and making sure that we're building the system and acknowledging that if we're doing it alone, like if we fund something by ourselves, we're probably doing it wrong. We need to bring others alongside us as a regional philanthropy, bring federal partners alongside us. So that's sort of the lessons in laying out. But there's also a key role for philanthropy. Like when you're talking about standing up things like the Rural Partners Network, that takes a long time to do. And so philanthropy, we're able to adapt and react quickly. And so there's a key role for us to set up these investments and set the conditions for success in rural communities. I also talk about this dilemma between downstream and upstream. We could be dealing constantly with the downstream impacts, particularly since the Great Recession, where you see this wide gap between urban and rural in terms of socioeconomic indicators, anything you want to look at. We could all day be dealing with like poking our hole and putting duct tape on the cracks that are emerging for our communities, whether that's food security. I mean, we have food pantries that need help. We have healthcare inequities around healthcare access. We could be dealing with those all the time, but how do we start to get upstream and deal with some of these and be proactive? And that's really the challenge we're setting with ourselves with the broadband work. So I just want to leave with, we don't have the funding. There's not enough philanthropy to do the thing. The thing in this case being build out broadband. But we can fund the system that does the thing. And that's what I want to get at in some of these slides about how we're doing that. So setting it widely, I like to talk about minimum viable rural ecosystems. And so when you think about that, it's an acknowledgement, and we heard some of the talks earlier saying we can't separate the technical challenges from the capacity and the civic and the institutional capacity challenges. We have to get at both of those at the same time. And so when you have this situation where you have all this funding coming down without the civic infrastructure to pick it up and do something with it, that's not really going to be successful. So when you have these scarcity cycles and all of a sudden you get a deluge of dollars coming down, how does it get absorbed in communities and get placed and get managed correctly? So that's the challenge we're facing right now. So if we look at this minimum viable rural ecosystem approach, it would be what capacities, what arrangement of place-based institutions are necessary to initiate and drive positive social change. And that's where these high capacity intermediaries like rural LISC are so effective at working with some of our anchor institutions to move this work forward. Again, we can't make a choice. Every time we invest in the physical infrastructure or broadband infrastructure without investing in the capacity of our institutions to do this work, we are simply taking from what already exists, which is very minimum and over time has been eroding. So we have to address the institutional challenges as well. And I want to talk just quickly on two dimensions of this minimum viable rural ecosystem approach. The first is the unit or level of change. So how do we make sure we have capacity at the right levels? And so a lot of work on the precision around regionalization. We talked, not having for every small community to have to do this on their own, but can we put the right capacity at the right levels and this goes into a bit about defining those. Oftentimes capacity building, we just talk about it and we don't talk about at what level. Are we talking hyper local? Are we talking at a local, at a local municipal level? Are we talking regional, or are we talking at state? And when we have those, when we make those decisions explicit, we can talk about, okay, how do we build and design this for the right capacity at the right level? And that's a conversation that's incredibly important because you simply can't operate and scale in rural if you're not thinking about where we need capacity at the right levels. So this involves both launching new institutions. So in the case of CDFIs, I could talk about how we in East Texas, an area that we serve the size of South Carolina, 3 years ago, we did not have a single CDFI office in our entire area. There was literally nowhere to go. Now, after making some investments, we have Rural LISC, we have Communities Unlimited, and we have People Fund. We have 3 active in our area. Now, that involves looking at the ecosystem and saying, we do not have the right tools and the right institutions, and that creates a structural disadvantage for our communities, and there's no way to move forward without bringing those right partners into the mix. So that was incredibly important to zoom out and look at the ecosystem rather than, okay, we're just going to make some small business loans, rather than thinking about how do we sustain these institutions over time. The thing here too is what I talk about, this missing middle problem. So you have bottom-up processes that are occurring in community all the time. We have any place you go. I mean, all of us are so passionate because we love our communities, and there are people there that we love that are doing incredible work and are operating on shoestring budgets at the margin, picking up every single new task, wearing all these different hats. And then you have federal. We obviously, if we're here at this conference, we're hearing about the work happening at the federal level to bring dollars to the table. What's missing is I talk about the missing middle piece. Like, how do we connect the bottom-up community-driven processes to all of that federal funding that's coming down? And that missing middle piece is about local, regional capacity that's able to navigate this, that's able to connect the bottom-up community-driven processes with the top-down resources. And that missing middle occurs because we don't invest in long-term capacity. And that's really what this is about. Until we invest in the long-term capacity, we're going to keep having cycles where we don't have adequate capacity to absorb the capital, and then the narrative is going to continue that there's not enough opportunity in rural, but really it's a capacity challenge question. So again, building out that missing middle piece. Okay, so we have the level or the unit of change, and then we can just quickly, in terms of capacity, you know, what is the intervention type? So as philanthropists, you know, working in philanthropy, what can we do to build capacity? And it was alluded to in an earlier talk around NeighborWorks, but this is really the 4 areas that we can really invest in to build capacity. So break it down into these 4. So when we're talking about data, we've invested a lot of times. There's data deserts in rural places, and Brian's talking about it. Like every time we invest in data and unpack and learn more, the situation is often worse than we think it is. Like intuitively, we know things are bad, and whether it's in economic development or broadband access. But when we really try to address the data gap, without the data, we can't make the case to state partners, to federal partners about what our needs are. So this data can be catalytic, and we've done data, whether it's the Rural East Texas Economic Opportunity Analysis that looked at regional labor sheds and how we connect education to economic development, whether it's funding a regional reporter, a rural reporter with the Texas Tribune that's able to tell the stories of rural places, whether it's investing in mapping, broadband mapping, and having high capacity partners like Rural LISC bring other partners like Brian to the table. Like that sort of work is critical, and it can be catalytic, and it's driving change in East Texas because we now have data for these key infrastructure pieces. The other is technical assistance. So again, this deals with whether it's grant writing, whether it's finding, navigating grant databases, but also all the things we need from models for healthcare access, from broadband, from economic development. All of our communities need to sequence and integrate these things. So do they have access to the right technical assistance? And that's a key question that we ask. So things that we're doing in the grant writing, grant navigation space, investing in what just launched with our partners at Texas Rural Funders. We have a rural grants hub where our nonprofits can go find grants that have been curated specifically for rural communities. So it levels the playing field some for rural communities. The other is a grant writer. So we kept hearing that they can't afford grant writers. They don't have access to high quality grant writers. So we just created a vetted list of grant writers that are doing this rural work. So again, breaking down barriers. And then thinking about embedded technical assistance, so embedding technical assistance within our anchor institutions, and then looking at what's the right distributed network of technical assistance at the right level. So I'll talk a bit more about that. And then convening. I mean, we all know convenings like this, convening around a particular topic area like broadband, having workshops on water. We're able to bring together the partners at the right levels and move things forward via convening. And then the one that's often all the time what people think about philanthropy is just this last one, capital, but grant making, but also things like match funding. And we're thinking about how do we match the match? How do we make sure that when opportunities arise, we have flexible funding available to our partners to move things forward? And then certainly what we're seeing is the pre-development dollars. There's not enough. A lot of people are focused on match. It takes a long way to get to the match. So is there funding available for people to even organize and build that pipeline of projects and opportunities from local community needs to connecting and navigating it to the grant funding? So this is where we're at. So for the broadband infrastructure in East Texas, the reason we are represented well here and on these maps is, you know, everybody's familiar. I think this challenge of broadband access would be familiar for many people across the U.S. in rural places. But here's what we're doing and where we see we've made a large impact. And a lot of this work is in the past 3 to 4 years. I mean, this is really sped up, and it's speeding up even faster because we've built the trust. So prior to Texas having a state broadband office, a lot of times, again, going back to this data desert, we didn't have accurate data. The FCC maps, as you said, were really bad. So we knew that just wasn't accurate. And so we went county by county and worked with Connected Nation and other partners to do the surveying to make the case to state officials and federal officials that it's really, really bad. We can say everybody knows it's bad intuitively, but until we had that data to say, in East Texas, we're paying twice as much for way worse service as a place like Dallas. And when you look at the economic situation, it's simply not fair. It's not right for communities to pay much more for much worse service. And the other thing around data is we had to do it like we were printing off handheld surveys because when you ask people to fill out a link, they need broadband to do it. Like it gets kind of absurd when you're like, how are we going to tell that you don't have broadband? Well, fill out this thing online. And it's like, well, yeah, exactly. So part of that is people use that data to then update the maps and make the case for the amount of funding that we need. And yeah, it's switched from served to unserved. So that's been a big one. Another one is working with our councils of government to place embedded technical assistance so that they can move forward. In the past 3 years, they've gone from having no capacity in broadband to now managing $70 million in infrastructure build-outs. So that's another way philanthropy can step forward in embedding personnel and moving that forward. And then rural LISC, looking at for digital inclusion, where is trust built up in our rural communities, and how do we repurpose some of these institutions, some of these anchor institutions for a new purpose? So working with a cohort of rural East Texas libraries, and that's something we can talk about. I'm seeing I'm way out of time. So I'll move.
That's okay. I mean, you've written the recipe card, Jerry, okay. And there's the visual, and these slides are available, right? So folks will have access to it. But I did want to invite Zaki back to, tie it all together. These are the ingredients. These are the teams. This is how we build capacity. It will work for broadband. It has in many of the examples that were shared. But Zaki, help us understand how Aspen Digital can also be a resource as communities are trying to build their plan.
It looks like we might have lost him, so I think you can continue.
Okay. Well, great. Well, I think we're at Q&A. If
Well, Christa, if you don't mind, before we go into DNA,
you synthesize, yeah.
So I had one thing I forgot to mention, and it kind of ties back to something that Jerry was talking about with, we've gotten new FCC data as of November of last year, and it is a dramatic improvement over what we had previously. But there's one issue that I'd like everybody to be aware of, because it is the primary issue I'm concerned about where we're going to miss things. And that is that the new data is address level data. But if you have a multi-dwelling unit, an apartment complex, low income housing, they count it as one location. And so if any unit within that structure has service, they will mark it as served. But we know that the internal wiring in many of these structures is insufficient, and therefore you'll have some of the units that do not have service. And there are funds to address the internal cabling in these multi-dwelling units, but if you don't identify them, you're not going to get those funds.
Brian, come to our session tomorrow. We'll be talking about the intersection of affordable housing and connectivity. And we have Jane and Kelly in the room who'll share more. So let's elaborate on that. I'm glad you brought it up, because it is about prioritization, right? I mean, there is very prescriptive direction in the BEAD program. And it really is exactly as you all have outlined. It's about communities putting up a hand and say, what questions do we have so we can implement to ensure equity and inclusion? Well, other synthesis themes that came forward for Benya or Jerry, or we can also hear from the audience. Yes, we do have a question, so maybe we'll go there.
Hi, thanks for all the comments. Greg Neachin from Kennyarth. Like Jerry, we're a lonely private foundation working in space. I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on foundation PRI making in this sector. We're a foundation that focuses exclusively on PRI making, low interest loans, and other forms of concessionary style investing. We've seen one or two broadband funds, one in Appalachia in particular, but I'm curious if there's any thoughts to that more broadly.
Yeah, so we've because for a lot of the issues we talked about the institutional capacity, just having CDFIs for the past 2 years located, having partners like Rural LISC really embedded with our local institutions. I think we're just coming up to the step of figuring out what would that look like? How do we source these sort of deals? What does that dashboard or clearinghouse look like for the marketplace for making these sort of deals? So I think we're just getting there. But this is about the prioritization and sequencing, but we have to turn these problems around and think in terms of decades, not months. I mean, like there's a lot of work we can do in philanthropy for getting this right in rural communities and move away from sort of projects towards these initiatives and pathways so we can get to where we're making PRIs, but somebody has to source those deals. You need high capacity partners working with communities, people that are mission aligned. We've got to get all of those pieces in place around a minimum viable ecosystem so that we can have some of these deals start to emerge. And the really cool thing is we're starting to see it. I mean, there's so much activity. And I was thinking for a good metaphor for this on the flight in. And do you remember those old game like Pong, where you had like one? I feel like a lot of rural communities were like on level 1 on Pong, and there's just boop water system, boop broadband, and like we need way more. Like, and then all of a sudden, all these balls get dropped in. Like, look at all the funding, and it just all falls through. Like, we need way more paddles. And so we're getting better paddles because we have these high capacity intermediaries. And so we need all these things pinging back and forth. And when we have that level of activity, we're going to see opportunities like PRIs emerge. We're just not at the stage where we can do that yet. So we need to get to level 10. Yeah.
I would like boop to be a quote from this panel.
But it's like boop, 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 boop. But yeah, that's what we're going for. Other questions?
So first, I just want to say my name is Reagan Claypool. I'm with Great Lakes Community Action Partnership in Northwest Ohio. And thank you to Christa and the panel. You've given me, and I'm sure a lot of others, great ideas and things to think about. My question is around, we have some wonderful stories of how we've used digital navigation in our local community. But what we're hearing from some of our local leaders is, kind of just as you mentioned, the same two people. So right now, this isn't my priority. Right now, water is my priority. So any tips or tricks or ways we can grab our local government's attention on this?
Yeah. We encounter this a lot. I think the community engagement piece is just so critical. And what I mean by that is, take Redwood County, Minnesota. We had a member there who was embedded in the county EDA office. There was like in the county office just one champion for broadband. It was the county EDA director, but to your point, she had she was also trying to just make sure all the small businesses, this was like when COVID hit too. And she knew she wanted broadband to be a key focal point for the county, but she was also capped with, making sure small businesses could fill out their ARPA forms, right? So just no capacity. Also had challenges, with a lot of these infrastructure grants, right? Like you have to show that there's a local match in order to get access to the state funding. So then it became an issue of needing to convince a board of county commissioners to say, yes, we're going to approve of this match. And it was pitted of, do you spend your county dollars on, road infrastructure, or do you put it towards broadband? And our member ended up doing a grassroots campaign that especially activating the farmers, where he had like lawn signs that said, "We believe in a fiber future." And he had that on, got all of his, friends and people he knew showing up time and time again for these community planning meetings. They formed this amazing broadband action team that was diverse of, education providers and teachers to small business owners to homecomers to like the full gamut of people who wouldn't see themselves in digital equity, but became spokespeople for the cause. And all of that needed to happen really before any of the further like investments into doing the digital navigation work. Like he first just needed to get the public pressure to say, this is something that we think is worthy of investment. And I'm proud to say now that I think it's like all but like 20 homes in Redwood County are over the next several years supposed to be connected now to fiber internet. So they managed to be able to get the state broadband grant to make that happen. So that's a hyper example to just say, like, I feel that, and I know our members are seeing that too. And I think that's why a lot of the technical assistance isn't just about, can you get somebody to write the grants for you, right? It's also about, can you have can you invest in the capacity building for the trust and the public pressure and awareness even that this is an urgent an urgent investment. And, you know, when it comes to getting, Chris, I'm sure you can talk about the many diverse, you know, financial opportunity centers that, you know, didn't see themselves as, you know, the backbone or the champion for digital equity, to see it as their issue and how they can start incorporating it. I'll just say what we're hoping to do with the Train the Trainer program is to teach others how to make the case for digital inclusion. So getting pitch decks ready to say, you know, here's, you know, another economic challenge that our community might be facing, and here's how it connects with digital connectivity, and start getting some of those resources and templates that, you know, okay, if you're not a digital equity organization, but you're seeing that it relates to you, what are easier ways that you can connect people getting your services to other digital equity opportunities? How can you get them to sign up for the American Connectivity Program as they're coming in for other services? So things like that of best practices that I think are emerging in our network right now too.
That's a great example, and I agree that you know, it does take a moment for organizations to see themselves in this work. Brian, I'd love for you to share a little example. Your BEAD is going to require match. Local governments can use their COVID relief dollars like ARPA for match. Can you share examples of where localities are really struggling with how to put skin in the game, even if they have that source, right, against all these other priorities for those funds?
Absolutely. Match is a huge problem for all of these grant funds. And the only two federal programs that you can use as match funding are ARPA and CARES. So for any community that made the decision to spend their ARPA and CARES dollars on things, they may have even spent it on broadband, but they didn't hold it back as matching funds for these larger programs, are at a severe disadvantage. And so we're seeing communities that have the worst problems, who got ARPA and CARES funds, who spent it addressing their problems, but now they don't have any matching funds. And one of the things that I found extremely frustrating, and this may be specific to North Carolina, and I'm going to frame a couple things in the North Carolina mindset, but we're not allowed to use charitable contributions as match. So there's not a lot of options to get those matching dollars if you don't have them. So you're kind of restricted on which programs you can use. A lot of those funds were spent on other very important things to those communities, and you can't go out and solicit from your charitable foundations to get these charitable contributions to provide that match. So many of them go without it. And another thing that's difficult is if you use ARPA funds, it raises the requirements of what has to be done with the money. It's a little bit in the weeds, but if you do not use ARPA funds, you can deploy broadband service that'll do 100 megabits down and 20 megabits up and meet the requirements. But as soon as you use ARPA funds, it's got to be 100 by 100. And that doesn't sound like a big distinction, but it rules out most fixed wireless and puts you in the wireline bucket. And wireline service, whether it be fiber or cable being the primary technologies that can provide those broadband services, that's a minimum of $1,500 per home. But when you get into rural areas, I've seen it go to $50,000, $60,000 per home to connect. And so you just end up with a bit of an impasse. And to address your other question about the leadership, we see in North Carolina that there's a great disparity between Western North Carolina and Eastern North Carolina. I started out handling mostly Western North Carolina, and we could apply to the Appalachian Regional Commission for all kinds of capacity building and infrastructure projects. But in Eastern North Carolina, we don't have that. And in fact, a lot of the counties we worked with in Eastern Carolina, they didn't have the STP. They had SP. It's the same person. And that person has zero capacity. So my advice is be loud frequently. Contact the broadband office. If the governor's office is having listening tours, go and make them listen. Jump up and down, yell and scream, make yourself heard. I don't know how else to do it. So any opportunity you get to raise this through media, through listening sessions, through contacting your state's broadband office, contact the governor's office, make a stink about it. That's my advice.
Good note to end on, but if you have 20 seconds, Jerry, you can close this out as well.
I'm never talking 20 seconds, but I'll just say, like, a lot of this is going back to the those three challenges. I keep thinking there should be no dead ends. Like, we need, available entry points. People are talking about entry points, but also no dead ends. So we got to keep breaking those staffing barriers down. That's why the ACC, like, when you're in those meetings and they say, who can take this on? The answer is often nobody can take it on because everybody's stressed, everybody's overtaxed. If we have fellows, if we have coordinators, if we have somebody that can say, I can take that on, that's going to lead us in the right direction to facilitate and coordinate some of this. And the other thing is just, we need to get to the point, like, I think my kids need a chance they don't have to stay rural, but they need the option for success rural. That's going to require broadband. And so we see some of these things. We've got to keep moving this conversation forward at the national level. And we need regional networks of all this. So it's starting to happen. We're so much further than we were 3 years ago. So we got to keep the momentum going. Always worried something about, I'm like, that's really, I mean, so you came down to, I just did Google Earth. Oh, weird.